So, as you can see, my presentation is called No One Cares About Polar Bears, except possibly Coca-Cola's marketing department. So today I'll be discussing how representations of climate change impacts in the American print media shape people's perceptions and opinions about climate change. But first I want to go over a small amount of introductory material. So climate change is a concept that most of you should be somewhat familiar with. Humans emit greenhouse gases, which trap solar radiation from leaving the atmosphere, which in turn alters the Earth's climate. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded in 2007 that anthropocentric greenhouse gas emissions have increased massively over the past few decades and will continue to do so in the future. As a result, it is almost inevitable that the Earth will experience significant negative consequences. Droughts, floods, rising sea levels, wildfires, storm intensity, species extinction, all these could potentially define the world of the future. Shown at the IPCC's estimates of global temperature increases by the end of the 21st century in a scenario of modest emissions increases. So as you can see, there's a little bit of a problem on our hands. We have about an average of about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of warming in most continents, in most areas of the world. So how many of you have heard of Jim Inhofe? Yeah, well, he's going to explain to you what the U.S. most significant action on federal climate change policy has been. As you can see, this is Senator Jim Inhofe and his family building Al Gore's new igloo. Jim Inhofe is one of the biggest climate deniers in the American political system. He's basically a cult figure, so to say. So basically this indicates that the U.S. hasn't really done much of anything in terms of addressing climate change. So let's go a little bit, let's briefly review a little bit of the history of climate policy. The U.S. has done basically nothing to stem the tide of greenhouse gas emissions that are produced domestically. In 1997, we refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, which would have tied us to mandatory reductions in emissions. During the Bush years, 3 separate attempts to pass some bipartisan legislation gained zero traction in Congress, and in the first years of the Obama administration, Waxman-Markey, the cap-and-trade legislation, fell flat on its face. As a result, our showing at the Copenhagen conference later in 2010 could generally be described as a failure, with no real mandatory target towards emission cuts. So now I want to segue a little bit into discussing media coverage of climate change impacts. The mass media is a very important source of information about climate change for the American public. The media educates readers, viewers, and listeners about the latest scientific findings, as well as about questions of policy and politics. So most Americans have at least some basic understanding about what climate change is and how it is expected to play out. So this leads me to my question of interest. Climate science is, in general, accurately portrayed in the American media and seems to be reasonably informative. Yet American climate policymaking has gone nowhere. What features of mass media coverage of climate change impacts might explain this phenomenon? So I'm looking for a defining feature of mass media coverage, and my hypothesis is that although climate science may be presented in a way that is technically accurate, there may be some hidden distortions in the way that that science is presented. And in particular, I hypothesize that the mass media outlets do not sufficiently cover localized climate change impacts. So what is a localized impact? A localized impact is, simply put, something that is geographically proximate to your community. So it's something that could occur in your city, your county, your state, or even perhaps a broader geographic region, such as the Gulf Coast or the Mid-Atlantic. There are 3 reasons why I believe this hypothesis is correct in the context of the broader research question. First, although most Americans believe that climate change is real, they do not prioritize it as a policy issue. Second, Americans do not prioritize climate policy because they do not understand how climate change will personally affect them. And third, the public lacks this information because news sources that they rely on for information, including the print media, rarely convey how climate change will specifically impact American localities. News sources tend to discuss impacts that are abstract and rather general. For example, they may discuss things like drought, but fail to mention specific regions of the United States where drought would be particularly likely. Or they may discuss impacts that, for most Americans, are simply out of sight and out of mind, such as, for example, polar bears in the Arctic. So with these 3 parts of my theory, logically my investigation consisted of 3 distinct phases. First, I wanted to gauge public opinion on climate change by analyzing survey data. Second, I wanted to explain these findings for the literature review. And third, the meat and potatoes of my research, I wanted to do content analysis of print media to analyze what sort of climate impacts received the most coverage. So the first part is simply a comprehensive approach to gauging public opinion about climate change. So from my prior research, I knew that there's a lot of different nuances that are involved in terms of what Americans tend to believe about climate change. I chose a time frame of 2006 to 2011, both because it's relatively recent and because it arguably marks the height of public attention toward climate change. So for example, An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore was released in 2006, and that commensurately increased media coverage of climate change. So after that, I collected survey data in 4 different areas, as you can see in the screen. So the first question is simply, is climate change occurring? Despite the dip after 2006, most Americans still think so. You see a 62% affirmation rate in 2011. So on face, it seems a little strange because if most Americans believe in warming, we would expect that we'd expect the representatives in Congress to be doing something about it. But of course, that's not the whole story. So the next question is climate change a policy priority? Just 26% of Americans thought so in 2011, which is down from almost 40% in 2007. Now, this may seem like a relatively significant number, but let's try to put this in context. Now on to something. Out of a list of 22 different policy areas, global warming came in 21st, behind such grave threats to U.S. health and welfare like K Street lobbyists. But don't worry, it's in good company with banning Happy Meals. The kicker, though, is that global warming isn't taken seriously even when it's compared to other environmental issues. In fact, more people aren't worried about global warming at all compared to those who are very worried. And to frame it in even more direct terms, just 32% of Americans think global warming will pose a threat to them or their families in their lifetime. So, at the end of the day, we have this disconnect. We've basically knocked the first part of the theory out of the ballpark because 62% of Americans think global warming is real, but 67% of Americans aren't even concerned about it. They don't think it will affect them. That means that we need to explain this. And to do so, I conducted a literature review concentrating on studies that examined how individuals tend to conceptualize climate change impacts and what effect that conceptualization tends to have on their beliefs about the need to combat climate change. So my research primarily centered around 2 different studies. In 2003, Anthony Leisowitz conducted a national mail response survey. One portion of this survey asked respondents to rate their level of concern about the impact of global warming on different spheres of social stratification: their family, their community, the United States, the world, non-human species. All these were different levels of social stratifications. Just 13% indicated that they were most concerned with threats to themselves, their families, or their local communities. Additionally, Leisowitz asked respondents to report prominent visual images of global warming that came to their mind. He found that 61% of respondents associated global warming with broad temperature increases, problems that are spatially and psychologically distant from the United States, such as polar ice caps melting, or impacts that are completely unrelated to global warming. So, he concluded that ordinary Americans' assessments of climate change impacts are fundamentally flawed. They assume that impacts will affect places that are geographically and temporarily removed from the world view. And the classic example is the polar bear. The vast majority of Americans will never see one of these in the wild for themselves. So, the second study I reviewed was a controlled experiment conducted by Scannell and Giffords. These authors presented subjects with information about a local climate change impact and more general climate change impact or no information. And the findings were pretty clear. Individuals who were presented with evidence detailing projected implications of local implications of climate change were more likely to support actions that mitigated climate change policy compared to those individuals who were presented with evidence of abstract climate change or impacts or no information whatsoever. So why is this? They came up with the theory of place attachment, which is basically individuals form bonds with their communities, and they feel that those communities form a core part of their identity. So when they're presented with evidence that a part of their identity is under attack, they're more likely to support actions to offset that threat. So now let's try to tie these parts together as recap what we've gone over. We know that while most Americans think global warming is real, they don't think it's a concern. But if they're educated about local impact that threaten the sense of place, we would expect them to be much more concerned, which means that we can conclude that the American public has not been sufficiently educated. And now we can examine the mass media's role in this. So recall the hypothesis, which is that local impact of climate change don't receive sufficient media coverage. My first two phases of research seem to support this, and now we need to analyze the media. So I chose to conduct a content analysis of print mass media sources. In particular, I sought to ascertain the extent to which local impacts are covered in the media versus abstract, broader impacts. To obtain a sample, I went through three major print newspapers: the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Houston Chronicle. The New York Times and the Post are known as prestige papers, which means that they have extremely high-quality news coverage and a national subscriber base. The Chronicle is one of the largest regional papers in the U.S. by circulation, which means that it provides a good basis for comparison in terms of how national papers compare to regional papers. I selected a 4-year time frame between June 2006 and May 2010 to line up with the survey data I collected, and also because it's relatively recent. So at one article per month, that yielded a sample of 48 articles, and 100 per paper and 144 in total. So I selected my sample through LexisNexis, which is an archive of newspaper articles. I use Boolean search logic, so I'm not going to really get into the specific terms I use, but in effect, my sampling method involved searching each paper 1 month at a time, sorting the list of articles chronologically, and then going through the results until I found an article that met the criteria for the sample. In effect, the criteria were, in order to meet the criteria, the articles had to be a news article, an editorial. That means that no sport columns, no letters to the editors, no fashion articles. It also had to be at least 300 words long and had to mention a key phrase at least 3 times. A key phrase being something like global warming, climate change, carbon dioxide, something related to the subject. That was the most objective way to ensure that my articles I was selecting for the sample were actually about climate change. Then I quoted articles based on how they framed their discussion of climate change. So an example, so you can see here the different types of coding methods I use. So an example of a type 1 article would be an article about a study on Arctic ice melting. An example of a type 2 article would be about international climate summits. A type 3 article would be like a profile of a New England ski resort, and so on. So I quoted impacts as either local or non-local. So local impacts were explicitly tied to specific cities, states, or regions of the U.S., excluding the Arctic because it is so remote, whereas local impacts include impacts that are outside the newspaper's circulation area. So let's go to the results real fast. So the first way you can look at the results is simply counting the number of impacts. So in total, there are almost 450 impacts across the entire sample, 15.5% of which are local. But that's not a really good methodology because it's simply counting impacts. A better way is to count articles. So when we sort it by papers, we see that 25% of New York Times samples articles mention at least one local impact. That number was 16.5% for the Post, 27% for the Chronicle, and 23% of all articles across the entire sample. When we sort by article type, we see that 25.5% of science articles mentioned at least one local impact, but only 15.5% of political articles did so. The other categories were pretty small sample size, and they weren't necessarily very significant. We can also sort by geography. So I mentioned earlier that local impacts that are selected without regard, we can also sort by geography in terms of where the newspaper is located. So for the New York Times, its circulation area is generally, even though it's a national paper, it's based in the Northeast. And for the Washington Post, it's in the Mid-Atlantic, and for the Houston Chronicle, it's in the Gulf Coast. So you can see across the entire sample, about 12.5% of all impacts were located, were specific to the areas where the papers were located. We can also sort by the severity of the impacts as well. So a lot of articles mention impacts that weren't very significant, like moose migrations. However, I eliminated the shaft and looked only at impacts that could potentially threaten life and limb. And so I found even more specific results. You can see that the Chronicle is better than the prestige papers, although not by much, but only 16.5% of articles mention severe local impacts. And 14% of articles mention polar bears. This is anecdotal, but you can see if you compare it to, like, for example, how many articles were local, there's a pretty big disconnect. So now the conclusion. From what we've reviewed, there's pretty solid evidence to support the hypothesis. By multiple metrics, broad abstract impacts seem to get 4 to 6 times as much coverage in the print media as local impacts do. So this is a pretty salient explanation for why Americans aren't very familiar with local impacts. There's three caveats. First, it's impossible to quantify what a sufficient amount of local coverage is because we don't have anything to compare it with. Second, the Chronicle did slightly better, which means that there could be a difference between local newspapers and national papers. And third, the majority of we're only considering print media, which means that there could be differences in terms of, for example, television reports that are not captured by the print media. So finally, an explanation. Why are local impacts ignored? There's two main reasons that I speculate about. First, we saw that only 15.5% of political articles had local impact compared to 25.5% of science articles. And this may be because political articles about national or international policy may not necessarily be the best context to insert local information about impact. And second, the scientific literature on local impact is relatively small. This means that this is because the majority of impact assessment studies in the literature make broad claims about the effects of global warming on very large areas such as biomes or subcontinents. They seldom scale these claims to specific regions, which means that there's very limited potential for localized assessments. And this issue stems from the fact that there's scientific limitations associated with climate modeling. The more narrow you get, the less certainty there is, which means that most climate assessments tend to focus on broader scales. And that means, unsurprisingly, that there's relatively few stories on new local scientific impact findings. So with that said, I'm going to open it up to questions.